Rhododendrons in the Mist by Ruskin Bond. Blood-red fallen blossoms lay on the snow, even more striking when laid bare. On the trees they blended with the foliage. On the ground, on those patches of recent snow, they seemed to be bleeding. It had been a harsh winter in the hills, and it was still snowing at the end of March. But this was flowering time for the rhododendron trees, and they blossomed in sun, snow, or pelting rain. By mid-afternoon, the hill station was shrouded in a heavy mist, and the trees stood out like ghostly sentinels. The hill station wasn't Shimla, where I had gone to school, or Mussoorie, where I was to settle later on. It was Dalhousie, a neglected and almost forgotten hill station in the western Himalaya. But Dalhousie had the best rhododendron trees, and they grew all over the mountain, showing off before the colorless oaks and drooping pines. But I wasn't in Dalhousie for the rhododendrons. It was 1959 and the Dalai Lama had just fled from Tibet, seeking sanctuary in India. Thousands of his followers and fellow Tibetans had fled with him, and these refugees had to be settled somewhere. Dalhousie, with its many empty houses, was ideal for this purpose, and a carpet weaving center had been set up in one of the states. The Tibetans made beautiful rugs and carpets. I know nothing about carpet weaving, but I was working for CARE, an American relief organization, and I had been sent to Dalhousie with the approval of the Government of India to assess the needs of the refugees. This is not the story of my tryst with the Tibetans, although I did suffer greatly from drinking large quantities of butter tea, which travels very slowly down the gullet and feels like lead by the time it reaches your stomach. The carpet weaving center became a great success, and I went on to work for CARE for several years. But that's another story. Out of one experience came another experience, as often happens during our peregrinations on planet Earth. And it was during my stay in Dalhousie that I had a strange and rather unsettling experience. I was staying at a small hotel which was quite empty as no one visited Dalhousie in those days and certainly not at the end of March. The hill station had been convenient for visitors from Lahore, but partition had put an end to that. The hotel had a small garden, bare at this time of the year, but on the second day of my stay, returning from the carpet weaving center, I noticed that there was a gardener working on the flower beds, digging around and transplanting some seedlings. He looked up as I passed, and for a moment I thought I knew him. There was something familiar about his features. The slit eyes, the broad, flattened nose, the hare lip. Yes, the cleft lip was very noticeable. But he wasn't anyone I knew or had known. At least I didn't think so. He was just a likeness to someone I had seen somehow, somewhere else. It was just a bit of tease. And it would have remained just that if he hadn't looked up and met my gaze. A flood of recognition crossed his face, but then he looked away, almost as though he did not want to recognize me or be recognized. I passed him. It was curious, but it didn't bother me. He kept bumping into people who looked slightly familiar. It is said that everyone has a double somewhere on this planet. I had yet to meet mine. God forbid, but perhaps I was seeing someone else's double. I was relaxing in the veranda later that evening, browsing through an old magazine, and the gardener passed me on his way to the garden shed, put away his tools. There was something about his walk that brought back an image from the past. He had a slight limp, and when he looked at me again, his hare lip registers itself in my memory. And now I recognized him, and of course he knew me. I was the man who'd caught him rifling through my landlady's cupboards and drawers in Dehradun some 3 years previously. I had exposed him, reported him, suggested that she dismiss him. But the old lady, a widow, had grown quite fond of the youth and kept him in her service. He was good at running about and making himself useful, and in spite of the cleft lip, he was not unattractive. When I left Dehradun to take up my job in Delhi, I had forgotten the matter, almost forgotten the young man and my landlady. It was another tenant who informed me that the youth, his name was Sohan, had stabbed the old lady and made off with the contents of a jewel case and other valuables. She had died in the hospital a few days later. Sohan hadn't been caught. He had obviously left the town, taken to the hills or a large city. The police had made sporadic attempts to locate him, but as time passed, the case lost its urgency. The victim was not a person of importance. The criminal was a stranger, a shadowy figure of no known background. But here he was, 3 years later, staring me in the face. What was I to do about him? Or what was he to do about me? After Sohan had gone to his quarters, somewhere behind the hotel, I went in search for the manager. I would tell him what I knew. Together, we could decide on a course of action. But he had gone to a marriage and would be back late. The hotel was in charge of the cook, who, a little drunk, served dinner in a hurry and retired to his quarters. "Don't you have a night watchman?" I asked him before he took off. "Yes, of course," he replied. "Sohan, the gardener. He's the chowkidar too." An early retirement seemed the best thing all around, especially as I had to leave the next day. So I went to my room and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I pushed the inside bolts all the way. I made sure the antiquated window frames were locked. As I peered out of the window, I noticed that a heavy mist had descended on the hillside. The trees stood out like ghostly apparitions, here and there a rhododendron growing, like embers of a small fire. Then darkness enveloped the hillside. I felt cold and wondered how much of it was fear. I went to the bathroom and bolted the back door. Now, no one could get in. Even so, I felt uneasy. Sohan was still a fugitive from the law. I had recognized him, and I was a threat to his freedom. He had killed once, perhaps more than once, and he could kill again. I read for some time, then put out the light and tried to sleep. From a distance came strains of music from a wedding band. Someone knocked at the door. I switched on the light and looked at my watch. It was only 10 p.m. Perhaps the manager had returned. There was another knock, and I went to the door and was about to open it when some childhood words of warning from my grandmother came to mind. "Never open the door unless you know who's there." "Who's there?" I called. No answer, just another knock. "Who's there?" I called again. There was a cough, a double tap on the door. "I'm sleeping," I said. "Come in the morning." And I returned to my bed. The knocking continued, but I ignored it, and after some time, the person went away. I slept a little. A couple of hours must have passed when I was woken up by further knocking. But it did not come from the door. It was above me, high up on the wall. I'd forgotten there was a skylight. I switched on the light and looked up. A face was outlined against the glass of the skylight. I could make out flat, rounded face and cleft lip. It appeared to be grinning at me, rather like the disembodied head of the Cheshire cat in Alice in the Wonderland. The skylight was very small, and I knew he couldn't crawl through the opening. But he could show me a knife, and that was what he did. It was a small clasp knife, and he held it between his teeth as he peered down at me. I felt very vulnerable on the bed, so I switched off the light and moved to an old sofa at the far end of the room, where I couldn't be seen. There didn't seem to be any point in shouting for help, so I sat there, waiting. and presumably without a sound he slipped away, and I remained on the sofa until the first glimmer of dawn penetrated the drawn curtains of the window. The manager was apologetic. "You should have rung the bell," he said. "Someone would have come." "The bell doesn't work, and someone did come." I'm sorry. The fellow's a villain, no doubt about it, and he's missing this morning. Your presence here must have frightened him off. So he's wanted for theft and murder. Well, we shall inform the police. Perhaps they can pick him up before he leaves the town. And we did inform the police, but Sohan had already taken off. The milkman had seen him boarding the early bus to Pathankot. Pathankot was a busy little town on the plain below Dehradun. From there, one road goes to Jammu, another to Dharamsala, a narrow gauge railway to Kangra, and the main railway to Amritsar or Delhi. Sohan could have taken any one of those routes, and no one was going to go looking for him. A police alert would be put out, a mere formality. He wasn't on their list of current criminals. That afternoon, I took a taxi to Pathankot and whiled away time at the railway station. My train, an overnight express to Delhi, left at 8 p.m. There was no rush at that time of the year. I had a first-class compartment all to myself. In those days, our trains were somewhat different from what they are today. The first, second, or third class compartment was usually a single carriage or bogie. We did not have corridor trains. Bogies were connected by steel couplings. Otherwise, we were not connected in any way to the other compartments. But there was an emergency cord above the upper berths, and if you pulled it, the train might stop. There were always troublemakers on the train, just as there are today. Sometimes the chain was pulled out of mischief. As a result, it was often ignored. As the train began moving out of the station, I went to all the windows and made sure they were fastened. I bolted the carriage door. I was becoming adept at bolting doors and windows. Sohan was probably hiding out in some distant town or village, but I wasn't taking any chances. The train gathered speed. The lights of Pathankot receded as we plunged into a dark and moonless night. I had a pillow and a blanket with me, and I stretched out on one of the bunks and tried to think about pleasant things, such as scarlet geraniums, fragrant sweet peas, and the beautiful Nimmi, star of the silver screen. But instead, I kept seeing the grinning face of a young man with a cleft lip. All the same, I drifted into sleep. The rocking movement of the carriage, the rhythm of the wheels on the rails, have always had a soothing effect on my nerves. I sleep well in trains and rocking chairs, but not that night. I woke up to the sound of that familiar tapping, not at the door, but on the window glass not far from my head. The insistent tapping of someone who wanted to get in. It was common enough for ticketless travelers to hang on to the carriage of a moving train in hope that someone would let them in. But they usually choose the crowded second or third class compartment. A first class traveler, often alone, was unlikely to let in a stranger who might well turn out to be a train robber. I raised my head from my pillow, and there he was, clinging to the fast moving train, his face pressed to the glass, his hair lip revealing a part of a broken tooth. I pulled down the shutters, bolting his face, but agile as a cat, he moved to the next window, the sneer still on his face. I pulled down that shutter too. I pulled down all the shutters on his side of the carriage. He couldn't get in, bodily, but mentally he was all over me. Mind over matter. Well, I could apply my mind too. I shut my eyes and willed my tormentor to follow the train. No one fell off the train. At least no one was reported to have done so. But presently we slowed to a gradual stop, and when I pulled up the shutters of the window, I saw that we were at a station. Jalandhar, I think. The platform was brightly lit, and there was no sign of Sohan. He must have jumped off the train as it slowed down. It was about 1 in the morning. A vendor brought me a welcome glass of hot tea. Life returned to normal. I did not see Sohan in the year. Hello everyone, this is Suryanshu. If you enjoyed this audiobook, do consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like. It really helps. And do turn on the notification to get notified when I post new videos. So stay tuned for the next audiobook and goodbye until next time.